Friends, there is a qualitative difference between the handouts I gave you for the last two sessions and this handout. For the last two sessions, essentially, I gave you encyclopedia articles and abridgments of scholarly articles. This, on the other hand, is an outline of the lecture I'm about to be giving. So you'll notice that we don't have other authors here. On the other hand, this will help you follow what we're talking about today. Last week, we were looking at the externals of our Jewish history, the political context into which our Jewish ancestors found themselves. And of course, it's very important. I mean, could you imagine, I was sharing this with Father Jared before, can you imagine someone analyzing the religious literature produced since January of 2025 in this country with no awareness of the political context? If someone noticed a new tone of anger or despair or what have you, and didn't have any sense of the political context, they simply wouldn't understand what they're reading. So that's important. But today we move from those external to internal issues. And I'm going to give you a framing thought for the entire lesson. In the half millennium of Jewish history leading up to the generation of Jesus of Nazareth may be characterized as turning elliptically around three core values: one God, one Torah, which is teaching, and one temple. That's an easy phrase to remember. One God, one Torah, one temple. And now I'm going to unpack that. Throughout the earlier period of biblical Israel, the entire span of centuries of the judges and the kings leading up to the Babylonian exile, there was a serious internal rift within biblical Israel on the subject of, are we supposed to worship the God of Israel alone, or do we have a syncretistic approach? The God of Israel plus the local gods. Now, this is very obvious, but we often miss it. We often miss it because we date monotheism very early. We say that Abraham raises his hand to God, the maker of heaven and earth, and so he's worshiping only one deity. We hear Moses announcing, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And we date monotheism very early in the biblical experience. And of course it's true, but it's not the whole truth. Because any two chapters of any of the prophets will show you that they are castigating the Israelites, whether they're from the northern tribes of Israel or the southern tribe of Judah. They're castigating them for worshiping other gods. So the witnesses right there on the scene are telling us that the Israelites themselves are not getting the core message of the Bible. What is the ratio? Well, just to give you one illustrative example, Elijah on Mount Carmel, facing down the priests of Baal, the prophets of Baal. Remember what the ratio was? 450 to 1. 450 priests and prophets of Baal, and Elijah, only I remain. Right? So, why would the Israelites so badly miss the core message of the Bible? Well, the simple answer is also very simple but easily missed. The Bible at that time wasn't a product. It was a process. It was still a borning. So what is so clear to us in retrospect was not clear back then. And what made it clear? Catastrophe. Catastrophe made it clear. And indeed, some of us know this from personal life. Oh, that visit to the oncologist made me stop smoking. Or, complete that sentence as you will. You understand, right? So the catastrophe for Israelite and Judean life was the loss of independence. For the northern kingdom, the loss was irretrievable because the Assyrians, those who conquered the northern tribes, had a policy of not only exiling those they had conquered, but scattering them throughout the vast reaches of the Assyrian Empire. And those are whom we call the lost tribes. And ever since then, there have been intriguing reports of people who've gone to Afghanistan and this place and that place, and they seem to come across some remnant of these lost tribes. But nothing more than a remnant. Very different was the experience of the tribe of Judah, because they were exiled to the capital city of Babylon and more or less left alone there. The Babylonians, as cruel as they were in destroying the temple and putting down the revolt, they were not Nazis. They didn't exile the Jews to extermination camps. They took them to Babylon, and they thought that they had solved the problem. Now, there's a good reason why they thought they had solved the problem, and I'm going to remind you of the story of Naaman, you might call him Naaman, who goes to the prophet Elisha and says, the Israelite slave girl who works for my wife says that I should go to you and you will cure me of my leprosy. So Elisha says, fine, go bathe in the river 7 times. And Naaman says, I came all the way for you to tell me to take a bath? I could take a bath in Syria where I live. So Elisha says, suit yourself. But he says, I've come all this way, so I'll give it a try. Right? And sure enough, Elisha prays, and he's cured, and man, is that a conversion. And then he says something so interesting to Elisha. And if you think carefully what he says, you realize what the psychology of paganism was of those days. He says, I'm going to worship the God of Israel from now on because, he's got the high octane. But I need 2 donkey saddlebags worth of earth from Israel so that I can create a proper altar back in Syria. In other words, he didn't believe in extraterritoriality. I remember when I was in 6th grade growing up in a parochial school in northern New Jersey, and my teachers told us that today we're going to Israel. And we were so gullible that, we got very excited. They put us on a yellow school bus and we drove into Manhattan and we went to the Israeli embassy. So that's, 1 square block of Israel, right? Extraterritoriality. So Naaman believes that you can only worship the God of Israel if you have a patch of Israelite soil. See that? Otherwise, you worship the local gods. Right? If you're a forced transplant from upstate New York to Northern Virginia, alas, you root for the Commanders. Good times and bad. Once back when they were called Redskins, back in the day, my son, who was then a little boy, said to me, why do we root for the Redskins? I said, you root for your home team, and when they do poorly, you keep rooting for them and it builds character. So he appreciated that. And then at one point, after they'd lost another several games, they were champions of losing in the fourth quarter. He said, "Dad, don't we have enough character now? Can't we root for a winner?" So that was the feeling. You root for the home gods. What's more, and you know this from the Iliad, if this army has defeated that army, if this champion has defeated that champion, it means that the winner's god has defeated the loser's god. So why worship a loser's god? Why worship a god who's a loser? Loser is a weaponized word in America today. Right? So the Babylonian thought was, we get the Judeans to Babylon, and the problem is solved. We will never know what percentage of Judeans felt that same way. They did the conventional thing. They started worshiping Marduk and Ishtar and the local deities. And they are, just like the 10 lost tribes, they are lost. But there's something different here. What is different is monotheism. Monotheism leads to surprising conclusions 2,500 years ago. And one of the most surprising conclusions is that we lost, the Babylonians destroyed the temple, and all of it was consistent with the will of the one God. The one God suffered us to lose, and God had good reason for that. I recommend that when you have a chance, reread, because I'm sure you've read this, reread Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address about how the will of God prevails, and it's often not the same as the will of those who invoke God. Well, Abraham Lincoln read his Bible, but the parts that were influencing him go back to this passage here. Think about Leviticus chapter 26, that fearsome list of curses. Okay, if you disobey God, this is going to happen to you. And then if you keep on disobeying God, that's going to happen to you. And if you disobey God and you don't come back, and you don't come back, and you don't come back, you're going to lose your independence. And you're going to be exiled from the good land. Now, you'd think that's the last penalty clause. But then Leviticus 26 has a turnaround. And there, in the land of your exile, if you have a regeneration of your heart, then God will remember the covenant with Jacob, and God will remember the covenant with Isaac, and God will remember the covenant with Abraham, and God will remember the land. And you'll be restored. So that notion, which is a direct consequence of belief in one God, allowed the Judeans, some of them, to escape the fate of every other group that was exiled throughout the Neo-Babylonian period and throughout the Assyrian period. They were able to go to someplace else and not just root for the home team now. They're able to retain their belief in the one God. In fact, it probably became more pronounced and refined than ever. If you read the second Isaiah, you'll see, I think it's chapter 44, he has a derisive account of idolatry, and he turns it into mere fetishism. He says, think about this. A man takes a block of wood. From half of it, he throws it on the grate and warms his feet and says, "Ah, my tootsies are warm." The other half he fashions into an idol and he bows down to it. Did you ever hear of anything so stupid in your whole life? That's Isaiah. That's the critique of idolatry that emerges from the monotheism of that generation. I believe that you were studying the prophets just before our series began. So perhaps this is all fresh in your mind. So this notion of the one God is totally revolutionary. And it has deep roots in biblical history, but it comes to a new fruition in this era in Babylon. So that allows the possibility of regeneration. consider a few verses from the book of Lamentations, which is the meditation upon the recent loss. Nachnu fashanu umarinu v'ata lo salachta. Lamentations 3, verse 42. We have sinned and transgressed, and this time you didn't pardon us. That's why we're here. So what should we do about it? Nach pisa derachenu v'nachkora v'nashuva ad Adonai. 2 verses earlier. Let us examine our ways and test them. Let us return unto the Lord. Is such a return possible? The second to last verse of Lamentations. Hashivenu elecha v'nashuva, hadesh yamenu kekedem. Turn us, O Lord, back unto thee, and we shall return. Renew our days as of old. And in my mind, amen. Because we say that line, it's the last line we say when we put the Torah scroll back in the ark. So when we finish singing that, everyone goes, amen. So that's what I'm thinking in my mind. So return is possible because the one God is also a forgiving God. Return will be productive, and that's the message of the second Isaiah. Make straight a path through the wilderness. Army Corps of Engineers should figure out how they do this. Lift up every valley, lower every mountain. Route 80 from Hudson River to Oakland, California, perfectly straight. Right? So that's what Isaiah is talking about. Make straight a path in the wilderness, which no road builder back then ever tried to do. It was impossible to build a road straight. You had to follow the contours of the land. So monotheism triumphs, and those who return to Israel demonstrate that. Very interesting archaeological findings. Archaeologists have done a lot of excavating in biblical era Israel, and they find little fertility goddess figurines, Asherah they're called. And by the way, I don't think that they're Hugh Hefner toys. No, I think they're much more serious than that. I think that women in labor would clutch them and pray as they were trying to stay alive and deliver a baby safely. You don't see them in the strata of the excavations that are post-return to Israel. You see them in the 900s and 800s and 700s and 600s, and you don't see them after the 500s. So the material evidence corroborates the literary evidence. The rabbis, for example, said that our ancestors suffered the loss of the first temple because of idolatry and sexual immorality and wanton bloodshed. But they weren't guilty of that in the Second Temple period. Why was the Second Temple destroyed? They said because we had causeless hatred against each other, because we didn't remember that we are community. An important sermon for today that won't be preached right now. So the rabbis themselves admit that idolatry was not a problem in the Second Temple era, and the archaeological findings corroborate that. So we have one God, the idea of the one God finally emerges triumphant. Now, the next consequence of this is surprising, because throughout the First Temple period, the one God was known, one God communicated through several channels, one of which was prophecy. A prophet, don't think of Jean Dixon with her crystal ball and the National Enquirer magazine, every January 1st, Jean Dixon's predictions for the year 1973. Remember those things? I do, I'm old enough to remember that. That's not what we mean by a prophet. Think of a prophet as an ambassador from the kingdom of heaven to tell us folks down here what we should be doing differently. So that's totally consistent with monotheism, but it wanes and it disappears. Why is Malachi the last prophet? interesting question, and like many interesting questions, it's a productive question. It leads us to a better understanding. Part of the enterprise of turn us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall return. Part of the enterprise of return is respectfully, even lovingly, to collect every scrap of authentic tradition that we could find. This is the activity of the leadership of the Judeans, whom we can now call the Jews, in the Babylonian exile and in the Persian period, once the Persians take over. I'll give you a T.S. Eliot line to remember this. You may have read The Wasteland at one point. And there's a lot of quotes of famous classical literature. And at one point, Eliot reflects, he says, "These fragments have I shored up against my ruin." Remember that line? It's the only line from The Wasteland that I remember. I studied in 12th grade, but that line I remember. "These fragments have I shored up against my ruin." That's what the leaders of the Jewish people were doing in Babylon, saving every bit of authentic tradition. I can even imagine some intrepid priest having run into the burning temple in 586 and scooped up some sacred scrolls and escaped with them. And then in Babylon comes the task of collating them and redacting them. And what if they disagree in certain details? Keep them both. That's why the story of Noah, as we have it, has in one chapter, take the animals 2 by 2, and then in another chapter, take them 7 pairs and 7 pairs. Well, 2 by 2 is not 14 by 14. But one of our traditions believe that animal sacrifice began as early as Cain and Abel, and another one of the traditions that's found in the Bible believes that no, it begins at the time of the Exodus and the consecration of Aaron. So the way of remembering history that sacrifices existed in that early time, you need more than 2 by 2, because 2 by 2 would be making a species extinct. So we had internal contradictions, and they said, we're not going to decide that one of them is unimportant. We'll keep them both, and we'll harmonize them as best we can. We have a story where God creates the world and the plants are created before the humans. That's Genesis chapter 1. Then we have a story where God creates the humans and then the plants, Genesis chapter 2. We need them both. They each teach sacred lessons. We'll figure out how to harmonize them, but we're not going to say that one of them is unimportant. The result is the Pentateuch. And one of the key moments in the history of the Hebrew Bible is narrated in Nehemiah chapter 8, where Ezra, a scribe from Babylon, now Persia, now working as a member of the Persian bureaucracy, with imperial permission, brings the Torah to the Jerusalem community and reads it, and they ratify it. That was our Philadelphia moment, ratifying the Torah as our constitution. One God, one Torah. Suddenly, prophecy is obsolete. Because suddenly, if you want to consult the Word of God, you don't have to worry about one guy being a charismatic liar. We see already in the book of Deuteronomy some concern about that. In Deuteronomy it says, what if a prophet should arise and tell you to do this or that? How do you know if the prophet's telling you the truth? How do you know if he's a true prophet or a false prophet? And the book of Deuteronomy says, if he's advising you to keep these laws, he's a true prophet. If he's advising you to break these laws, he's a false prophet. And so, what do you need a prophet for? If the prophet's function is simply corroborative, a teacher could do that. A scribe could do that. Ultimately, a rabbi could do that. You don't need a prophet. And so once Ezra's Torah, the product of centuries of the monotheistic saga, but collated in Babylon, brought back to Jerusalem and ratified by, say, the mid-400s. Once that is the new basic religious modality of how Israel and her God are in contact, prophecies are redundant. Which might be why, near the very end of the last prophet Malachi, he says, Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi. Remember the Torah, remember the teaching of my servant Moses. If I had a visual imagination better than the one that I have, I would create a monument stone for prophecy, and that would be the epitaph. Remember the teaching of Moses, my servant. That's the prophets as a movement passing the baton to scribes, to teachers. In rabbinic literature, we call them the men of the great assembly, people who were not themselves prophets, but who received the authority to teach God's word. So the two of the unities that I'm describing are one God and one teaching. It's significant that we don't have rival recensions of the Torah. I mean, think about this. We don't have four different rival Torot. We have a collated recension of the one Torah. Consider this too. We know from the available evidence that this Torah was copied and recopied faithfully, and of course scribal errors occur, but the degree of uniformity is very, very high. Do you all know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? So, Dead Sea Scrolls were written about, no, they weren't composed. They were written about 2,000 years ago, give or take. They were discovered in 1947. Now they're on display in the museum. They're studied around the world. The degree of agreement between the text of the Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we call the Masoretic, the traditional text, is over 98%. Which means that the text was largely stabilized early on. And you can find this in another way as well. Translations of the Hebrew Bible. There were two translations in pre-Christian times, probably more. One into Aramaic, which was the official language of the entire region, and one into Greek. The Greek translation probably goes back to the 200s before the Common Era, during the reign of one of the Ptolemy kings, one of the Hellenistic kings of Egypt. And we call that the Septuagint because of the legend that it was done by a committee of 70 scholars, and they were each in a separate room and they agreed word for word. Now, if 70 Jewish scholars, each in a separate room, can agree word for word, that, my friends, is a miracle. If 2 Jewish scholars could agree, that's already a miracle. So, if you compare the Masoretic text with the Greek text, you have a few differences, a few. And you have some obvious additions. For example, in the book of Esther, there's an additional letter that the Achashverosh writes, allowing the Jewish people to defend themselves, and says, because the evil Haman was in league with the Macedonians, which is very much a Persian versus Greek thing. It's not the concern of the biblical book of Esther at all, but you understand that in Hellenistic Alexandria, that would have been a good detail to add. But if you take out the obvious additions, which are from the Hellenistic provenance, or the obvious changes, you know those ages of the antediluvian patriarchs and so on, they're significantly different in the Septuagint because the authors wanted the founders of Hebrew culture to be older than the founders of Greek culture. They learned it from us. Just like you may have seen in yesterday's newspaper, a Brazilian nationalist campaign to say that our guy preceded the Wright brothers in heavier than air flight, right? Those Americans are stealing our invention, right? I remember when the old Soviet encyclopedia proved that, Russians invented everything. Remember that? So, I've been to Kitty Hawk, and I'm still voting for the Wright brothers. So the translators of the Septuagint wanted the Greek cultural heroes to have learned their philosophy from us. And you understand that. There's a kind of a nationalistic rivalry going on. But when you factor out those obvious editings, what you're left with is a translation where if you reverse engineer it, you come very, very, very close to the text that is the Hebrew Bible. Which means that this one Torah had a stabilized text both in Israel and in the Jewish diaspora. That's a very, very important fact, because it means that this one Torah functions as a constitution. And to go back to last week's lecture, whenever the high priest and a delegation of high-ranking officials would go to a new Gentile overlord, like, for example, the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus III, when he conquered the land of Israel in the year 202. They went to him and they promised loyalty if he would allow the Jewish people to live by ancestral custom. And there was no skin off his nose to let them do that. Let them take care of their own civil and criminal cases as long as they pay their taxes and stay loyal. That's what mattered. So let us live by minhag avotenu, the custom of our forefathers, by ancestral custom. What that meant was Torah. So we have one God and we have one Torah characterizing this period. We also have, with very minor exceptions, one temple. That's the third one thing which is characteristic of the life of the Jewish people in the half millennium leading up to the generation of Jesus of Nazareth. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, Moses says, when you get into Israel, don't worship God on every hilltop and under every leafy tree. Now, I've done a lot of shopping in Hilltop. I don't know how much worship is going on there. Maybe they're worshiping Mammon rather than God there. But this notion of don't have a decentralized worship. Go to the place where God says, I will put my name in residence. And that's where you will bring your sacrifices and your free will offerings and your vows and your pledges and your this and your that. Do it in one place. Well, that one place in the course of Jewish history came to be Jerusalem, when Solomon built a temple which was a housing, basically, for the Ark of the Covenant. In the book of Deuteronomy, the campaign to have that and not any of the decentralized shrines is brought to a new level of fervor. Because it seems that throughout the First Temple period, you had these decentralized shrines, but not after the exile. The Persians allow the Judeans to come back home. They have a political leader named Sha'altiel, who was of the Davidic dynasty, and his nephew Zerubbabel, but then that somehow gets discontinued. They didn't keep any Davidic monarchs, but they did keep the high priest as the other chief guy. So the high priest becomes the CEO of the Jewish people by around the year 500. And the high priest was located in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, for brief periods, there were other temples, very brief. There was a Judean border garrison that worked for the Persians at the southern border of Egypt in an island in the Nile called Elephantine. And they had a temple there. Further north in the Nile Delta, there was another temple called the Temple of Onias in a place called Leontopolis. And that remained until Vespasian and Titus destroyed it in the year 73. But those are minor exceptions that affected some channels of piety for Jews in Egypt. But around the world where Jewish people lived, the temple in Jerusalem was the center of their religious life, whether they got to it or not. Every Jewish adult male paid a 1/2 shekel temple tax every year. It was taken to the temple. So the temple was also the treasury, which is why the Roman Crassus looted it, which was a catastrophe in Jewish history. To this day, on the Sabbath of the new moon of Adar, which we just had a couple of weeks ago, we read about the 1/2 shekel because it was basically the IRS telling you your taxes are due in 30 days. And we read it in the synagogue to this day, 1/2 shekel to the temple. So there was one temple, and the one temple had a hierarchy. It had a high priest who was theoretically from the direct primogeniture lineage going back to Aaron. Now, interestingly enough, even when usurpers tried to inject themselves or their quislings or their favorites as high priest, they tried to make the lineage work. The same way that, the Habsburg emperors would hire genealogists to prove that they were descended from Aeneas, the founder of Rome, right? So even when they did violence to the institution, they were unconsciously accepting this notion that dynasty produces legitimacy in the high priest. Now, the temple was a profoundly conservative institution. Its function was to recreate the mode of piety that the Bible had authorized: animal sacrifice, selected prayers. But that wasn't all the people needed. So if you have one God, one Torah, and one temple, where will the tension between past and present be negotiated? It will be negotiated in the Torah, specifically in the interpretation of Torah. And if you want to understand this, this is our bridge to next week when we start talking about Sadducees and Pharisees and so on and so forth. But I'm going to create the conceptual grid now so we can understand it. You have a U.S. Constitution. It's ratified by the 1790s. Within 10 years, some major questions arise, and Chief Justice Marshall issues an opinion in Marbury versus Madison about issues that aren't clearly stated in the Constitution itself. How do you apply a Constitution to changing times? Right? That's a question any time you have a Constitution. I once saw a very fine movie set in Ireland starring Pierce Brosnan called Evelyn. Did you ever see the movie Evelyn? It's a lovely story about this man who loses custody of his daughter because he's a drunkard, and his wife leaves him and goes to Australia, and under the Constitution of Ireland, adopted in the 1930s, without the mother's written permission, a child taken into foster care couldn't be back into the father's custody. But they had a written constitution then. And the father manages to take it all the way to their high court, and this is in the 1950s, and that was the first case where the High Court of Ireland found a given law passed by the Dáil, the Parliament of Ireland, to be unconstitutional. and they struck the law because it was unconstitutional, which is, of course, one of the functions of the U.S. Supreme Court. So that happens when you have a constitution. You can negotiate the tension that grows between past and present. One of the tensions that grew was how do you rest on the Sabbath? The Bible is written for a pastoral people, but by the Hellenistic time, Jews are living in villages and cities and living a commercial life. What does Sabbath rest mean when society is very different? I'll give you just one other example. In the Bible, a man marries a woman by paying a dowry to her father. In Rabbinic Judaism, the man writes a ketubah, which is a pledge to be given directly to the woman, not to her father. How did you make that change? How do you make that change and claim loyalty to the Bible at the same time? So what we find is that, as in every other constitutional system, there are strict constructionists and loose or broad constructionists. And that's inevitable when you have a constitution. So next week we're going to see how those very issues affect Jewish life so strongly right around the time of Jesus of Nazareth. So just to recap, we've seen that the independence of the Jewish people was gone, but the triumph of monotheism, the acceptance and ratification of the one Torah, and the centrality of the one temple in Jerusalem created the structure of the Jewish religious life of the times and places that we are studying. Please ponder that, think about it. Next week we'll take our story forward.